nation, founded less than 250 years ago, transformed from a collection of colonies into one of the most powerful countries the world has ever seen. Born in the late 18th century, the United States spent its first decades focused on expanding across North America. But through war, industry, and an unrelenting pursuit of influence, it grew into a global powerhouse, reshaping the world politically, economically, and militarily. So how did this young country rise so quickly to the center of global affairs? To understand, we must explore the key events, decisions, and ambitions that propelled the United States to its unprecedented position of power. The United States today stands as the most powerful nation in history. With more than 800 military bases worldwide and accounting for 37% of global military expenditures, it has established itself as the centerpiece of a vast, interconnected global system. This system has contributed to an era of remarkable prosperity and relatively low levels of conflict on a global scale. To understand the United States' role in the world and its critical importance in shaping international politics, it is necessary to look back to its origins, a time when the country held no significant power on the world stage. In its first 70 years as a nation, the United States grew substantially in both land and influence across North America. This territorial expansion eventually brought the country to the Pacific Ocean, but it came at a devastating cost, including the widespread displacement and mass killing of indigenous peoples who had lived on the land for centuries. In those early years, Americans were sharply divided on whether the nation should extend its reach beyond the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans. This debate became especially heated following the Civil War. Some leaders, such as Secretary of State William Seward, believed that the United States should pursue ambitions as a global power. Seward managed to secure the purchase of Alaska from Russia, a move that expanded the country's territory significantly. However, his proposals to acquire Greenland and Iceland, as well as to annex regions in the Caribbean, were rejected by Congress. Many Americans, including members of Congress, strongly opposed imperialism during this era. They feared that overseas expansion would entangle the U.S. in global conflicts and create challenges integrating populations they viewed as racially or culturally inferior. This anti-imperialist sentiment acted as a check on the push for expansion. However, the late 19th century brought changes that shifted the debate. The Industrial Revolution fueled explosive economic growth, requiring a stronger, more centralized government to manage the economy. This empowered leaders like President William McKinley to pursue expansion more aggressively. A key turning point came in 1898 with the Spanish-American War. Despite domestic opposition, McKinley led the U.S. into war with Spain over Cuba. The U.S. swiftly defeated Spain, gaining control of Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines. That same year, Hawaii was annexed, providing a critical Pacific outpost. Soon after, the U.S. added Wake Island, 1899, and American Samoa, 1900, furthering its reach across the Pacific. By 1903, the U.S. controlled the Panama Canal Zone, a vital link between the Atlantic and Pacific that became essential for trade and military strategy. Over the next decade, it intervened militarily in the Dominican Republic, 1916, and purchased the Virgin Islands, 1917. This rapid expansion marked the U.S. as a rising global power. Beyond territorial gains, the U.S. also sought to protect its commercial and strategic interests abroad. It supported pro-American regimes in Nicaragua and played a leading role in China, promoting the open-door policy to ensure equal trading rights. This era solidified the U.S. as a global power, with its territories, trade policies, and military strategies laying the foundation for its 20th century dominance. World War I highlighted just how much the United States' influence on the global stage had grown. American intervention played a critical role in bringing the war to an end, shifting the balance in favor of the Allies. President Woodrow Wilson personally attended the Paris Peace Conference, where the terms of the post-war settlement were negotiated. Wilson also championed America's most ambitious foreign policy initiative to date, the creation of the League of Nations, an international organization designed to foster peace and global cooperation. The League was an unprecedented attempt to reshape global politics and prevent future wars, underscoring the boldness of American foreign policy at the time. However, isolationist sentiment remained deeply entrenched in the United States. Many Americans, wary of entangling alliances and international commitments, resisted this shift. Throughout the Great Depression and the rise of fascist regimes in Europe, the United States remained largely focused on domestic issues in its own hemisphere, avoiding deeper involvement in European affairs. However, America's growing overseas interests made it increasingly difficult to ignore global events. In East Asia, Japan's expansionist ambitions posed a direct threat to American territories and military forces, escalating tensions between the two nations. This rivalry culminated in the attack on Pearl Harbor in 1941, which forced the United States into World War II. The Second World War profoundly reshaped America's role in global affairs. Unlike other major powers, the U.S. emerged from the war without economic devastation, retaining a robust industrial base and infrastructure. Furthermore, it was the sole nation to possess atomic weapons, cementing its position as a superpower. This transformation set the stage for America's central role in shaping the post-war international order. As a result, the United States found itself in a unique position to shape the post-war world. Determined to prevent another catastrophic conflict, it took the opportunity to lead in crafting a new international order. One of the most significant examples of this effort was the establishment of the United Nations. The UN Charter created a framework of international law that explicitly outlawed wars of conquest, such as those waged by Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan. It also provided a global forum for nations to resolve disputes through dialogue and diplomacy rather than conflict. The hope was that great powers could settle their differences peacefully, relying on compromise and legal mechanisms instead of resorting to war. While the UN is perhaps the most well-known post-war institution, it was far from the only one established during this transformative period. In 1944, 730 delegates from 44 Allied nations convened in Bretton Woods, a quiet vacation town in New Hampshire, to design a global financial system that would stave off another Great Depression and reduce the likelihood of future wars. The resulting Bretton Woods Agreement laid the foundation for modern international finance, creating the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund, IMF. These institutions aim to stabilize economies, foster global development, and promote international trade, making economic cooperation a cornerstone of lasting peace. By spearheading the creation of these organizations, the United States committed itself to addressing global challenges in a way that no other nation had before. However, this new role brought complications. The world's second-largest power, the Soviet Union, had an entirely different vision for the post-war order. While World War II had united the democratic West and communist East against Hitler, this alliance was born of necessity, not shared values. Once the common enemy was defeated, ideological differences between the two superpowers quickly emerged, setting the stage for a new and enduring conflict, the Cold War. The United States viewed Soviet expansion in Eastern Europe and beyond as a fundamental threat to its vision of a free-trading democratic world. As one contemporary sentiment expressed, in one form or another, socialism has spread the shadow of human regimentation over most of the nations of the earth, and that shadow is encroaching on our own liberty. This fear of Soviet intentions, particularly regarding Western Europe, led the United States and its allies to form the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO. NATO was a military alliance designed to deter Soviet aggression and protect European nations from invasion. Globally, the U.S. adopted a strategy known as containment, which sought to limit the spread of communism wherever it might take root. This strategy required America to maintain a constant global presence, exerting influence in regions far beyond its borders. Rather than dismantling the massive military infrastructure built during World War II, the U.S. kept it largely intact, preparing for a prolonged ideological and geopolitical struggle. This Cold War strategy had two major consequences. First, it drew the U.S. into strategic partnerships with countries it might not otherwise have allied with, such as Saudi Arabia, Israel, and South Korea. Each of these alliances was viewed as critical to countering communist influence in their respective regions. Secondly, containment led the U.S. to intervene, often covertly in numerous countries, to curb Soviet influence, and in some cases this meant supporting authoritarian regimes that aligned with American interests, such as in Iran. In other instances, it involved backing insurgents, like the Mujahideen in Afghanistan during the Soviet invasion in 1979, or the Contras in Nicaragua during the 1980s. These actions were part of a broader effort to weaken Soviet influence globally, even when it meant engaging in morally ambiguous or controversial tactics. The Cold War thus transformed American foreign policy into a highly active and interventionist enterprise that shaped international relations for decades. Throughout the Cold War, the United States intervened in countless conflicts worldwide, forging a complex web of alliances, rivalries, and obligations across nearly every region. When the Berlin Wall fell and the Soviet Union dissolved, the U.S. faced a choice: withdraw from this global system, reduce its military presence, and sever many of its Cold War-era alliances, or remain engaged as the world's sole superpower. While military spending decreased somewhat after the Cold War, much of the military infrastructure, along with key alliances, endured. President George H.W. Bush and Bill Clinton concluded that actively managing global affairs was in America's and the world's best interest. As Clinton put it, we should be and we must be peacemakers. NATO, originally formed to counter the Soviet Union, not only persisted but expanded, serving as a unifying force among European nations despite the absence of a Soviet threat. Similarly, long-standing U.S. support for nations like Israel and Japan remained steadfast, under the rationale that these commitments were essential for maintaining stability and deterring potential conflicts in volatile regions. The global network of alliances, institutions, and agreements originally designed to navigate Cold War challenges became permanent fixtures of the post-Cold War order. Maintaining this system required sustained American military and political engagement. The U.S. continued to act as a central force in shaping international relations, overseeing the alliances and organizations it had created to preserve peace and stability during the Cold War. This enduring role cemented America's position as the de facto manager of the international system, even in a world where the original Cold War adversary had vanished. The global system established by the United States during the Cold War continues to operate today, with little serious challenge to its existence by major American political leaders, except perhaps for Donald Trump. Trump's rhetoric has often been contradictory, but he has consistently questioned the value of key alliances and free trade agreements. He has argued that U.S. allies do not contribute enough for the protection they receive and suggested that countries like Japan, South Korea, and Saudi Arabia should take on more responsibility for their own defense. As Trump put it, "We're better off if Japan protects itself against this maniac in North Korea." Saudi Arabia? Absolutely. Such statements represent a sharp departure from the foreign policy consensus that has dominated U.S. strategy since 1945. Trump's views lean closer to pre-World War II isolationism, raising questions about whether he would dismantle decades of institution building and alliances. His presidency left lingering uncertainty about the future of organizations like NATO and the World Trade Organization, which underpin the international system. Whether such rhetoric will lead to lasting shifts remains to be seen. In its first 70 years, the U.S. expanded westward, claiming vast territories and reaching the Pacific Ocean. This expansion came at the cost of indigenous populations, whose lands were seized through violence and displacement. Debates over further expansion beyond the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans intensified after the Civil War. Leaders like Secretary of State William Seward envisioned America as a global power, but his ambitious plans to purchase Greenland and Iceland or annex parts of the Caribbean were blocked by Congress, reflecting strong anti-imperialist sentiment in the nation. Such resistance stemmed from concerns about global entanglements and integrating diverse populations. However, the Industrial Revolution, with its explosive economic growth, transformed the U.S. economy and concentrated power in the federal government. This set the stage for expansionist leaders like President William McKinley, who in 1898 led the nation into a pivotal war with Spain, marking the beginning of America's emergence as a global force. The swift defeat of Spain in 1898 showcased America's growing military and economic power. In the aftermath, the U.S. gained Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines, marking its first major acquisitions beyond the mainland. This era of expansion didn't stop there. Over the next 2 years, the U.S. annexed Hawaii, 1898, Wake Island, 1899, and American Samoa, 1900. By 1903, the Panama Canal Zone was under American control, further cementing its strategic and economic influence. The U.S. continued to extend its reach, sending troops to the Dominican Republic in 1916 and purchasing the Virgin Islands from Denmark in 1917. These acquisitions positioned the U.S. as a global power with territories and influence stretching across oceans. With its newfound status, the U.S. began to protect its interests abroad. It installed pro-American regimes in countries like Nicaragua and played a key role in managing Western powers' involvement in China, ensuring its commercial and military priorities were safeguarded. By the time World War I erupted, America's influence had grown considerably. U.S. intervention was pivotal in bringing the conflict to an end. President Woodrow Wilson attended the Paris Peace Conference, shaping the post-war order and proposing the League of Nations, an ambitious international organization aimed at fostering global peace and cooperation. However, domestic isolationism remained a powerful force. Congress rejected U.S. membership in the League, effectively dooming Wilson's vision. As the Great Depression and the rise of totalitarian regimes in Europe unfolded, America turned inward. Yet, escalating global conflicts drew it back into the international arena. In East Asia, Japan's imperial ambitions threatened American territories and forces, culminating in the attack on Pearl Harbor. World War II not only thrust the U.S. into global leadership, but fundamentally transformed its role. Emerging from the war economically unscathed and armed with atomic weapons, the U.S. was uniquely positioned to shape the post-war order. It spearheaded the creation of the United Nations, which sought to prevent wars of conquest and promote diplomatic conflict resolution. Alongside the UN, a global financial system was established during the Bretton Woods Conference, with institutions like the World Bank and IMF aimed at fostering economic stability and preventing future global depressions. These efforts solidified America's central role in the international system. The Bretton Woods Agreement, formed after World War II, laid the foundation for the global financial system, establishing institutions like the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund, IMF. These institutions committed the United States to playing a central role in managing global economic issues. During the war, the Democratic West and the Communist East had united against the common enemy, Nazi Germany. But their alliance quickly unraveled. The United States saw Soviet expansion in Eastern Europe as a direct challenge to its goal of promoting free trade and democracy. In response, U.S. leaders warned of the threat of socialism spreading across the globe, fearing it would erode liberty everywhere, even within the United States. To counter Soviet influence, the U.S. and its European allies established NATO, North Atlantic Treaty Organization, in 1949, a military alliance aimed at preventing Soviet aggression in Europe. This marked the beginning of America's global strategy of containment, designed to stop the spread of communism worldwide. The Cold War required the U.S. to engage constantly in global affairs, often leading to alliances with countries like Saudi Arabia, Israel, and South Korea, which were viewed as vital buffers against communism in their respective regions. At the same time, the U.S. intervened, sometimes covertly, in numerous countries to contain Soviet influence. This included supporting sympathetic dictatorships in places like Iran and arming rebel groups in Afghanistan in 1979 and Nicaragua in the 1980s. Throughout the Cold War, America's extensive involvement created a web of alliances, conflicts, and diplomatic relationships across the globe. Even after the fall of the Berlin Wall and the collapse of the Soviet Union, the U.S. did not retreat. Instead, much of the military infrastructure and alliances formed during the Cold War remained, reflecting America's ongoing commitment to maintaining global stability. After the Cold War, Presidents George H.W. Bush and Bill Clinton continued to prioritize America's leadership in global affairs. The United States, now the sole superpower, was seen as integral to maintaining international peace and stability. Both presidents championed the idea that America should actively manage global conflicts, as evidenced by Bush's statement, "We should be and we must be peacemakers." NATO, originally established to counter Soviet aggression, remained intact and even expanded, now serving as a tool to keep European nations united in the absence of the Soviet threat. The U.S. continued to support strategic allies like Israel and Japan, arguing that their security was crucial to preventing broader conflicts. The global system of alliances and institutions built during the Cold War thus became permanent, with the U.S. remaining committed to upholding these structures. Trump's rhetoric presents a stark departure from the foreign policy consensus that dominated the U.S. since 1945, with a shift towards a more isolationist stance reminiscent of pre-World War II policies. The key question remains whether Trump, as president, will act on these ideas and reshape America's global role. Only time will tell if his presidency will reverse decades of institutional development and alliance building.